Seemingly coming from nowhere, the streets of London were lit by fires and wrecked by multiple rioting during the second week of August 2011, just 11 months before the Olympic Games are due to start in the city. Ostensibly started by police shooting of Mark Dagan in Tottenham in North London, bearing the hallmarks of an extrajudicial killing, and further complicated by a series of media blunders and cover-ups by the Met as well as by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the riots did not bear the typical signs of political protest. While politicians and commentators were at a loss to know how to react, and academics kept silent, the riots multiplied and started to spread to other cities in England. After a week of looting and burning and the arrest and prosecution of over 1,200 people for related offences, a semblance of order has returned to the streets. The silence which followed these events was broken by a Guardian-sponsored large-scale research project. Questions are still left. Was this a disaster waiting to happen? Could it happen again? What does it tell us of the police and its communal concept? But more than anything, what does it say about the crisis of capitalism and its corrosive effects on society and its moral values?
Marcus Dow, are you shocked by what you've seen there last night?
No, not at all. I have been living in London for 50 years. There are so many different moods and moments. But what I was certain about, listening to my grandson and my son, is that something very, very serious was going to take place in this country. Our political leaders had no idea. The police had no idea. But if you looked at young blacks and young whites with a discerning eye and a careful hearing, they have been telling us, and we would not listen, that what is happening in this country to them.
Mr. Howe, if I can just stop you, Mr. Howe, for a moment. You say you're not shocked. Does this mean that you condone what happened in your community last night?
I condone, of course not. What I'm going to condone it for? What I'm concerned about more than anything else, there is a young man called Mark Dagan. He has parents, he has brothers, he has sisters, and few yards away from where he lives, a police officer blew his head off.
Well, Mr. Howe, we have to...
Let me finish.
Mr. Howe, we have to wait for the official inquiry before we can say things like that. We don't know what happened to Mr. Dagan. We are going to wait for the police report on it. If I can take you on a little bit, you were talking about your grandson, you were talking about young people. You were talking about your grandson, you were talking about...
They have been stopping and searching young blacks for no reason at all. I have a grandson, he's an angel, and he began to think he was coming of age when the police slapped him up against the wall and searched him, and he thought he had now had a gold star. I asked him the other day, apropos of a sense that something was going seriously wrong in this country. I said, how many times have the police searched you? He said, Papa, I can't count. There's so many times.
Mr. Howe, that may well have happened, and if you say it did, I am not to gainsay you, but that is not an excuse to go out rioting and cause the sort of damage that we have been seeing over the last few days.
Where were you in 1981 in Brixton?
Mr.
They had I don't call it rioting, I call it an insurrection of the masses of the people. It is happening in Syria, it is happening in Clapham, it's happening in Liverpool, it's happening in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and that is the nature of the historical moment.
British government and U.S. government actuaries put out in the last 4 years predicted that as austerity hit, there would be more and more rioting and social unrest, especially in the underclass or welfare class. The police in England have now confirmed to the BBC and others they were ordered to stand down last Sunday. And only now are they talking about stopping the looters and rioters who are not political. This is not a political revolution. You don't see them going up against the city of London within London where the big mega banks are based, or storming the palaces and castles of the British royals who get tens of millions of dollars in welfare every year. You don't see them going after the parliament. No, they're burning third, fourth, and fifth generation small family stores, people's homes. They're carjacking people and running over folks with cars, murdering them, all for the fun of it. It is the football hooligan type of individual who is simply out there celebrating criminality and wanton abandon. Most of them have been confirmed as welfare recipients living in government housing. This is what the social engineers have created, and now they're going to use these rioters as a pretext to take the rights of all people in the UK to even peaceably assemble. And there's calls to start shooting any type of demonstrator on sight instead of dealing with people engaging in arson, looting, and other plunder. I would also add the British people are not allowed to defend themselves via the Second Amendment. They don't have a right to defend themselves. And so they have some of the highest rates of home invasions, robbery, muggings in the world. Their crime rate has exploded in the last 15 years since the right to keep and bear arms was all but abolished in the UK. But never fear, the citizens are banding together. Muslims particularly have been fighting back and defending their stores and property. We've seen Sikhs, a religious faith based out of India, guarding their homes, businesses, and temples. And the British government has now come to them and said, do not defend your property. Stand down so that the looters can burn you out of house and home, and they're refusing. But see, that's the type of lawlessness the government won't put up with, is people lawfully defending themselves.
We now need restraint and calm. And I say to those who wanted to come to Tottenham to cause violence and disturbance to stay away. We don't need you. We don't want 25 years of rebuilding community and trust destroyed because of mindless nonsense.
I don't really think that the riot came out of nowhere. I think even if you look on the Guardian website, the week before, there's a film of the young people in the neighbourhood saying the riots are coming. Nick Clegg made his injudicious comments predicting riots in exactly the scenario that emerged. Christine Lagarde from the IMF was saying the riots were coming. So I feel that everybody knew that the riots were pending.
We should have seen it coming, given the way in which I think the country has, well, particularly successive governments seem to have completely marginalised or excluded a whole section of society.
And which section?
I think that the poor.
And I think there are complicated causality in spite of that general familiarity with the idea that this explosion was ready and primed. I think, you know, there's a very strong and rather unexplored connection with the protests of the winter that preceded it, with the young people, the EMA people, the generation locked into the experience of indebtedness as a defining experience.
They're trying to manage the kind of the much more structural exclusions through programs of equal opportunities, certain kind of discourses of representations of diversity agendas. We have more kind of celebration of differences, etc. But the deep inequalities in terms of, if we look at who runs organisations, who has control over organisations, even liberal organisations, so-called like higher education. Think about who the senior members of governance are, or in the police, etc. I mean, the deep failings, really. So I do think race in Britain has always been. I think Lawrence was important because race in Britain is largely an unsaid thing.
I mean, the people who planned and managing these operations know very well that any trivial incident can be the precipitating mechanism for a much larger conflict they're unable to control. If you look at the things that the police wrote after 1981, their analysis of what happened and the way their practice was altered in the intervening period, their reorganisation, the new balance between community organisation policing, multi-agency policing and the militarisation of policing, they understood that well, and they wanted to be able to have a much more coherent military, pseudo-military element in the way that violence was organised in response to this as a way of offsetting that, and they wanted certain innovations at the level of the police station. I mean, you could uncharitably, and this is one thing I think that came across in the play of the riots, I don't know if you went to look at the play, was that it's very clear that if the police officers in the station in Tottenham had been more thoughtful, more prepared, they would have managed the whole sequence of events in a completely different way. So there's something about the division of labour inside the police, actually, which will need to be looked at, I'm sure. They're already doing that. The people that shot Mark Duggan, I don't know how much they talk to the people in Operation Trident, which is a different chain of command, a different institutional group, and then of course the local police in the Tottenham police station. There's at least 3 different actors, and they all have slightly different interests in this, and they all have a slightly different mechanism of accountability within the larger structure of authority. So there's a lot that's changed in the way the police approach their business, which seems, I would say, to be implicated.
Absolutely systemic failure that has been uncovered even without having an inquiry. And what's shocking is that hasn't raised larger questions. And as we see with still information coming out, in the aftermath of McPherson and in the aftermath of these particular convictions of Stephen Lawrence, that failure, as we know, was systemic, and the level of that failure has still not been uncovered, including very credible allegations of police corruption and collusion, with gangsters who were connected with the alleged killers of Stephen Lawrence. So, we have systemic failures, that some of which are coming to light. I mean, News International is another one. And what we find is that the organizations that are supposed to be the monitoring organizations are not doing the adequate policing.
And at the same time, we know that in the Duggan case raises issues about the relationship between Metropolitan Police and its information strategy, and the interests of the media in the form of News International and other groups, which are not, again, they're not interests or agencies that are simply about transmitting information after. Their information is designed and organised so it loops back into understanding of the events in real time. So, we have to kind of cultivate, for me, I think, a kind of systematic estrangement from that. There is nothing, I think, I'm not sure that anybody has anything to lose from disassociating themselves completely from the overground world of official media. I think that we have to get away from that. And, I know that academics are told we're supposed to have impact, and people think that going on the radio or going on the television or running to the House of Commons is a very special kind of impact. But actually there's no impact there at all. It's a certain kind of ritual dance that becomes a kind of currency in the economy of the institution as it dies.
And talking to Tories, bankers that I know, in fact, they said, this feeds our narrative. This is fine. They were not distressed by it. Hence, no equivalent of Scarman. What I think they're probably quite clear about is that they're going to manage inequality. They are going to manage inequality in increasingly repressive and violent ways wherever they can. And at the same time, some loosening of, I think we should say this is a kind of success, that although there are many racialized narratives, the idea that you can be a card-carrying racist and be a respectable person has been attacked because of the kinds of movements that we came from. So it's not acceptable in football, there are huge rows about it. It's not acceptable in many other places. The chairman of the Tory party is a Muslim woman, a conservative Muslim woman who defends arranged marriages, attacks, aggressive secularism, visits the Pope, visits the Islamic countries and so on. This is important because people who talk about, talk about new forms of racism, talk about exclusions of particular groups of people without looking at the ways in which some people have been incorporated in, the glass ceiling in some instances has been shattered, and a few people do manage to rise into the professions. So if you can get out of working class inequality, you might well succeed. It's a version of a very attenuated version of the American dream. But if you can't, you're going to be managed, with all the powers of the state, which include surveillance powers, which include heavy policing when necessary, and so on, and spying and, everything else. So I think it is about managing inequality while creating, a slight rhetoric of upward mobility, the possibility of upward mobility, as an exceptional thing, that if you're exceptionally talented, you can succeed. I think those two things are going to go together.
I'm never optimistic about the situation in Britain. You look at the historical situation of the British left, it's always following behind what's happening elsewhere. I always say this to people, Britain, you had to have a socialist in the White House for 20 years before the British political class would abandon its commitment to liberalism for one generation. We went all through the 30s, everywhere else was fascist and communist. America elected a socialist for 20 years, implementing the New Deal. The British political class remained totally attached to Victorian economics. It was only after that, and only after the war, only after the experience of war, where for a year, we were being invaded by fascists and our only allies were communists, that you got Britain turning towards kind of collectivist, social democratic solutions to problems, really only for one generation.
Society is organised by these elites who actually are robbing us, and they're the violent. You have a government in external wars, internal policing, and you have a kind of economic system which is really in kind of meltdown. And you have people who are still actually a whole set of bankers and a kind of a corporate culture which basically bleeding you dry. This is the real violence in some senses, and and in a way they're a kind of a response to that, but it's not a politicized response in that sense. It's as and consumption, consumerism become the kind of only way of articulating a certain need.
I think a lot of that's to do with the fact that there is a sense of cynicism, and I think the sense of betrayal. So that betrayal and alienation that people feel, it's not only against the ruling classes and the elite and those with wealth, but I think in some ways it's also directed, maybe not expressed in the same way, against others who have not been able to reflect those kinds of, that sense of alienation, injustice, frustration, anger in their programs and agendas for progressive politics by which to move forward, to create a momentum. I think the trade union march, for example, that took place was great because so many people were on the march, and many people, who not the usual suspects, families, ordinary people, students, on the march because of how their lives were going to be turned upside down by all the had been turned upside down by what had occurred and what would occur in the future. But I was surprised that, that didn't lead to general strikes, or it didn't lead to something much more. So we have these kind of pockets of protests,
The moment that one of the biggest moments for 30 years of capital in crisis, globally and locally, you would have had a kind of much stronger opposition at a popular level. But in fact, what we're seeing, and this is, I think, in Britain in particular, a moment of crisis for instance, race. And I've said this a number of times now, is that we're seeing a much more authoritarian response to the riots, but to asylum and refugees. And you see a moment of economic crisis, race will re-emerge. So all the people who argue that Britain is progressive on issues of race will now starting to unravel, and we're going to see a much more right-wing political agenda. The kind of vilifications of Roma people, vilifications of asylum seekers, Muslims, other ethnic minorities who want to articulate a different political agenda are being actually excluded with very little response from the mainstream society. So in some senses, it's a much more pernicious and dangerous moment. Because in one sense, as we know, once you have crisis of capitalism and you have a kind of breakdown in social order, you get authoritarian, right-wing, neo-fascist kind of forms of governmentality. And we see that in terms of surveillance, in terms of social control, and I think we'll see more of that for a while.
The interesting thing is, why then do we see in the polls either that Cameron is managing to stay ahead or maybe 1 or 2 points behind, but really why hasn't that support sort of peeled away? And I think maybe the reason for that is that what the government's successfully and cleverly doing is not new, but it is, it's dressed in a new way, if you like, which is to actually create a consensus amongst those who don't have anything, if you like, who don't have a stake, on who is deserving and who's undeserving. I think there's a narrative that's sort of underlying this, that plays into and which prevents that kind of popular vote from peeling away, because suddenly I see the way in which the welfare reforms or the austerity measures are often couched in terms of the deserving and undeserving. And with that, there is a whole narrative around criminality in society. And so what I think is happening is that it plays into people's fears about their own uncertainties, and they look towards other groups rather than, I'm actually quite surprised that the anger, although there is anger, and it's pretty much widespread against the bankers and the bonus system, and even amongst MPs, and that kind of culture of taking expenses and things, taking more than just expenses and things. I am actually surprised that anger hasn't reached that tipping point, and I think it's because there's a successful play at diverting attention to other groups who are seen as scroungers, who are seen as somehow not deserving. And I think those groups include immigrants, migrant people coming in, refugees, for example. I think they include the travelling community. And I think that whole, for example, eruption around the Dale Farm is part of that narrative. And I think that it plays into people's fears, and it makes people feel that those are the undeserving, and that they are the ones who are preventing others from sort of having a rightful place in society or having access to the resources. So I think there's that deserving, undeserving narrative is partly responsible perhaps for the popularity of the government.
The social fabric that we have created, that we fought for, that helped to change Britain, has been systematically reduced to rubble, first by the Labour administration, and now continuing by the Tory administration. And it's closely connected to policies on counterterrorism.
Oh, absolutely. I don't blame the coalition government. I think Tony Blair and New Labour started this. And I actually think that the coalition government are building on what already, in terms of the ground that was already prepared. And I think that New Labour turned its back, essentially, on the people that it supposedly should represent. And I think that, so most definitely these are successive government policies. These are not, you can't lay the blame on one door only.
I think in the Britain, and maybe the British, one has to think about these different movements and politics still, even though we're in a globalised situation, in quite national terms. So there are some differences, for instance, in the way the Arab countries responded to the certain kind of political crisis. In Britain, I think the problem is that the left is kind of very fractured. And actually there's no consensus of and there's no political organisations that could articulate themselves across very different kind of formations. And I think that's a kind of deep weakness really in any kind of politics. While I fully endorse the occupation movement, and I think that's some of the most interesting politics, because it does begin to cross class, race, gender lines in a way that previously hasn't. Actually, we've had a neoliberal consensus on the left as well, a sort of centre-left politics of opposition, which is actually quite complicit with the kind of dominant cultures. And so in terms of issues to do with particularly economics, but also to race, there's a sort of kind of liberal agenda, which is a sort of attempt at partial inclusion. So there is a kind of hegemonic project in an old kind of Gramscian sense of a kind of inculcating society into a certain kind of project, which is about a very national British project of reinventing Britain for a globalised situation, which really starts with Thatcher, then Blair, and now Cameron continues it. And I can't see much of a difference in those things. And within that, of course, the political oppositions are at best self-defence. I mean, there's been very little purchase on, for instance, changing the Labour Party's position around any of these kind of issues. It's largely been complicit with kind of hegemonic structures.
I mean, I think we have to, be quite kind of clear about this, ruthlessly clear. I mean, what left are we talking about? There is no left, actually. There's no left, We're not talking about people in the Labour Party, I'm sure. That their interests are particular, but they have never, in the history of the Labour Party, I might add, shown themselves to be inclined to support the just grievances of people against power when they resort to violent resistance. And if you look at the effect of the miners' strike on the left, that's one instance of this, but you can go further back actually into the history of the Labour Party to see exactly those ambiguities, and particularly of course in government but also outside it. The relationship between the Labour Party as an organised political force and the police itself is a very interesting relationship. So I would say that when we say left, I'm not sure that we mean the Labour Party. So what do we really mean? At community level, community organisations, or of course it's going to be a slightly different story, because there are, certainly on the ground in Tottenham anyway, there's an elaborate network of political and community organisations, which is going to be, without in any way minimising the trauma to the whole community, or without, naively embracing, some sort of inappropriate strategy of violence, is going to be sympathetic and is going to be able to understand, is going to have an interest in trying to understand what actually happened. But I don't know that the left, the organised left, is inclined to do that. Now beyond that, I suppose there are the ultra-left groups, the Trotskyists and other groups, and what remains of those groups, I think, was inclined to try and engage, but they're often, although actually I must say not exactly in the case of Tottenham, but they're often in a position that we know very well, where they are essentially paratroopers, coming into a place from outside, because they are very small and they don't have any resources. I'm not defending or excusing them. I'm just trying to say it's very easy to say the left, when actually there is no left, there is no left.
I think so. I think that we've concentrated on difference. The government concentrates on difference, but it has another agenda. And I think the left's concentrated on difference, but without, which has lapsed into a very reactionary kind of politics. And I think that we can't distinguish anymore. I think I struggle to find a left that's progressive on equality issues across the board. I think we were attempting to. I don't want to say that there was a golden day of left movement, and there wasn't. But I think that things, through internal struggles, whether it's feminism, whether it's the sexual minorities, on all these areas, we were internally struggling to be more inclusive and looking at the ways in which multiple forms of discrimination work. But I think that the identities now are so much more rigid. They don't leave room for empathy. I don't think they leave room for seeking unity across difference.
I hope I've been absolutely clear in my conversation with you that I'm not enthusiastic about rioting. I'm not enthusiastic about it. But I suppose I wonder whether it's some kind of moment in which the kind of culture of privatization is itself called into question, both by the appeal to solidarity at the community level, and also by the experience of watching the things you've taken for granted being dismantled by the rioters, by the police, by the media. There's a sense in which it returns us to the possibility or to the hunger for a kind of mutuality, a kind of reciprocity in terms of culture and society. And people can say, they find out what they really think in this moment, and they say, well, actually, it's wrong to burn people out of their homes. It's wrong to destroy your own environment. And there's a lot to be said about that I don't know has even come out in the research that's been done yet, in terms of thinking about which buildings, for example, in different places were targeted. This kind of question. There's a lot more to be said about how not to justify things retrospectively by making them political in a formal way or showing that they're more. I mean, of course, they're going to be more politically sophisticated than people would have expected. That's not the point, really. It's a question of how the discussion about these functions to bring something like a sort of solidary community alive again. And I do believe that that's possible, even if it's only to say, well, we're not the people that wave our brooms, we're not the gentrifiers, we're not that actually the interests of this community might lie in protecting its young people, protecting them from the police, protecting them from the destruction of education around them, protecting them from the idea that their needs are going to be met by the institutions of what remains of our welfare state. There's a different set of possibilities that arise in the aftermath of this that I think are grounds for hope.
I mean, I think that in a very bizarre way, the riots became a symbol of the success not only of the older immigration of say Asians into this country, but also of the new immigrants, the new white East European immigrants, because some of the most iconic images of the riots derive from what happened to them. So one was the image of the woman jumping out of the burning building, and she was an East European. And if I recall the story correctly, she was saved not by the actual forces, that were standing there, of the state, who were, I don't know, obeying some health and safety regulation not to intervene or something. I mean, I don't know what they were doing. But by her friends, who were also East European immigrants, who ran out with mattresses and things and urged her to jump. I mean, this is people having to really defend themselves and create their own solidarity, not with arms, but to defend them, to actually act practically in their own interest. And then you have the immensely sad story in contrast of a pensioner, an old white man who is killed in the course of the riots, and nobody knew his name. The atomization of English, white native English communities, in contrast with the solidarities expressed, by immigrants, old and new, was stark. And it speaks to something that fascism will find fertile ground in. And I think if we don't rebuild the solidarities that we had, not on a communal basis, not just on a basis of this type of religion being nice to that type. I mean, it did help in some circumstances, but we need to build a wider solidarity than that, and we really need to address the internal ruptures between the different communities, black communities in this country, Asian and Africans and Caribbeans, and rebuild solidarity that's anti-racist, but not on a platform of thereby supporting another form of discrimination and violence, that is fundamentalism.
That's the other end of what I was trying to hint at when I spoke about the transformed relationship between politics and information. It is a case where we have to go, in a different place than Machiavelli would take us in order to understand the relationship between information and power. And we know that the prince must be a liar. That at least is useful. But we imagined that having more information was going to make our field of action more habitable. And actually what we've discovered is that one can have too much information, and that having more information isn't necessarily helpful, because actually finding out what's going on in the world becomes a kind of full-time occupation that prevents you from being able to act in your own interest.
And it's more difficult to make connections between the different disparate...
Indeed. We need a sort of political sociology, not of knowledge, but of ignorance, actually. We need to understand how ignorance is created and reproduced. What are the institutional conditions in which ignorance is maintained? We need a history of that problem. And when I say ignorance, I mean people will maybe recoil a little bit from the force of that word, but I think that's what we're really talking about. We're not just talking about not knowing about things, the sense of not knowing. There's a sort of larger set of questions at stake there in terms of what it is to be literate, what it is to be politically and culturally and technologically literate, in ways that equip you to make the kinds of complicated responses and judgments that you're going to need to make in order to protect yourself, never mind anything else.
Let's take the Occupy movement in St. Paul's, for example. I think that when all's said and done, or Wall Street, I think when all's said and done, for me, there are glimmers of hope in what they achieved. Because what they did was, in their own way, through other means, through social networking and the media kind of technologies that I can't even grapple with, that don't even understand. I think the message got out. There's a public consciousness. There was a public consciousness around the kind of obscenities of capitalism in the way that we'd not seen before. The way in which the public discourse, and I think that was fed in part by Occupy movement and by others. So that's a good thing. That's hope. It doesn't mean that, we're seeing the end of capitalism. I wouldn't even say that perhaps more than just softening the edges is what's happening. But even the public consciousness that was growing in terms of bankers' bonuses and anger at the system, that kind of, that materialism, go-getting, self-centered obscenities that we have lived with for so long. And I do think that the Occupy movement and the protest movement started by these students and so on, have contributed to that wider national public debate. That's a good thing. That's hope, I think. It's better than what we had when the Soviet Empire, if you like, disintegrated, and when the Cold War ended and all that. It seemed like the triumph of capitalism. And that was really hopeless, because it seemed like there was nothing in its place to check. And so seeing in its very tiny, small way, this kind of, at a national level, these pockets of protest and the way in which at least public debates were beginning to talk about obscenities of capitalism, it's a good thing. Internationally, of course, we have to look to what happened in the Middle East. But I am very, very hesitant at the same time in terms of calling it an Arab Spring. It's unfinished business. And I think that the vacuum that has been created, with the necessary toppling of undemocratic authoritarian regimes, is being filled by possibly other authoritarian, religiously inspired in a fundamentalist way. But nevertheless, there is hope in the way in which those people did rise up. And for me, one of the important lessons of what happened in terms of the uprisings or revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa was that they at least appeared to be under the banner of human rights for all. And why that's important is because part of the narrative, and in terms of the moral bankruptcy of the left in this country, has been based on this assumption that somehow human rights are Western concepts, and what that showed was that these people everywhere, wherever there's injustice or oppression, are fighting for their human rights. And these are not Western notions, regardless of the historical origins of human rights. These are evolving rights, and they're being struggled for by people everywhere. So that was another, if you like, glimmer of hope for me, is that at least we can try and blow a hole through that assumption, which the left have bought into, which is that, human rights, Western, and to be anti-imperialist, to be anti-racist, we must allow for other normative values and systems to flourish, which may actually be very undemocratic and unhuman rights in terms of minorities and women. So I think that, there is hope, but there is always side by side. The signs of hope also show signs of danger. The two go hand in hand. And it's how wise we are, I think, how truly we seem to absorb the lessons of history in terms of avoiding those pitfalls and dangers as we move forward. I'm not sure I've answered that question at all for you, but for me there have been little glimmers of hope, and that's all we have to hang on to. The rest is about vigilance, hard work, and continuing battles and creating a movement. I don't know how that will come about. I think that hopefully maybe in the kind of wider public spaces we can talk about the riots, for example, in a way that also allows for a discussion on policing of certain communities, but also allows for a discussion on materialism and what it does to communities, but also allows a discussion on macho cultures that are sustained and fostered in these protest movements as well, and what that means for women's rights. So it's up to us to use those forums to try and sort of have that wider discussion, which then might allow for a politics of unity to be forged.